Hello and welcome to Ukraine in Flames, a special project by Ukraine Crisis Media Center, Ukraine Catholic University's Analytical Center, and NGO Euro-Atlantic Course. My name is Alexandra Tsikhanovska. I'm the head of Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group at Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and I'm pleased to say that after having discussed what the support of Putin's regime is based on in Russia itself, which we talked about in our previous video, we turn to a bigger picture and take a look at what factors and actors enabled the Russian Federation and its war against Ukraine on the international level. If you want to know more, please subscribe to our channel to stay tuned. Russia has been actively exploiting the cleavages and vulnerabilities in many European societies, securing at least some of the support in many countries, although the majority of it has faded away with the start of Russian barbaric large-scale invasion of Ukraine. However, there are specific countries where governments are, for various reasons, inclined to maintain ties with the dictatorship and impede the support for Ukraine in this war. We start today's conversation with Ivana Klimpush-Tsintsadze, a Ukrainian MP and head of the Committee for Integration of Ukraine into the European Union, who concisely and profoundly lists all the key factors that enabled the Russian Federation and Putin's dictatorship on the international arena, from some of the corrupt local politicians loyal to Moscow to supporters of the appeasement approach, and more.
It seems to me pretty obvious to understand who is behind the international support of Putin. The other question is, what is behind that support? But let's start with who. From my perspective, those are different type of Schroders and Fillons that are even trying to distance themselves from Putin in this particular moment, but they, as bribed politicians, are behind the decisions that have caused this barbaric war that we are finding ourselves in. Obviously, those are also numerous politicians and numerous international bureaucrats in different international organizations who have been pushing for policy of appeasement of Putin, disregarding the experience of Munich 1938, forgetting and pretending not to really understand the signals that Putin was sending by his actions in Georgia in 2008, by his actions in Ukraine in 2014, his actions in Syria and in other parts of the world. Also, among those who supporting Putin are numerous media representatives, analysts who have been used as so-called useful idiots working on the Moscow money. By the way, the whole concept of useful idiots was created back in 30s by the USSR and has been used by Kremlin ever since. Kremlin also efficiently has been using the doctrine of hybrid war and has been fighting different countries in the 20th century as well with the same instruments as it is fighting Ukraine in this particular moment. We are talking about Finland, we are talking about Spain, about Vietnam, and other countries in the world. Among those who also are big business owners who prefer to put forward their profits and not to notice even the war crimes of today's Russian regime. And that means that we see their actions even in this dire times today. We see how even in the most comprehensive sanctions that have been introduced, how they are trying to use the loopholes. For example, we understand that this Sberbank mobile app was removed from mobile stores, but we also know that it works very well if it was uploaded earlier. Or, for example, we hear that Visa and MasterCard have stopped their operations in Russia, but they have stopped only issuing new cards, while at the same time they managed to prolong the term of validity of all those cards that have been issued earlier. So this is about who, but what about what? And that first and foremost is the Western energy dependence on Russian Federation. Until it exists, Russia will continue receiving billions of dollars daily, and that will allow it to continue its war against Ukraine, to continue killing our kids, raping our women, destroying our homes, our economy, our country as such. Secondly, the inability and non-readiness of the West to recognize that Putin has started World War III on the territory of Ukraine. And at this particular moment, there is a chance to ensure that this war is not spilling over to other regions. But that means Putin has to be stopped here on the territory of Ukraine. And that means really providing Ukraine urgently, as soon as possible, with real heavy weapons, with everything from fighter jets to heavy artillery to air defense of mid to long range of tanks and other military equipment. And that means really, really comprehensive sanctions without loopholes. And that means a full resolve to continue helping Ukraine until it wins in this particular war. And the third major what is the concept that seems to be preoccupying at this particular moment Western minds, believing that it is Putin himself and only Putin who is guilty of this particular war. And that concept is totally wrong. Because before Putin there was Stalin, before Stalin there was Lenin, before Lenin there was some emperor that also participated in the start of the World War I. The whole history of Russian Federation is the history of fighting, conquering wars. 70% of its historic time of its existence, notwithstanding the name of this particular country, it has been fighting wars that would envisage conquering additional territories. It has been living on expansion of its territories and made up external threat. And always, during centuries, Russian population has been supporting its rulers. So therefore, we have to understand that it's not only Putin who is guilty of this war, that it's a collective responsibility of Russians. And it's important to understand that Russia will continue to pose existential threat to the Western civilization until it exists. It poses existential threat not exclusively to Ukraine, but to the whole Western free world. And that means that what has not been finished after the end of the Cold War has to be finished today. And that means that Cartagena has to be destroyed.
When discussing the international support behind Putin and his regime and the Russian Federation in general, it is also important to understand how Russia exploits ideological divisions in the West, particularly the far right and the far left fringe movements groups, which are often actively collaborating with Russia. Oleksiy Harань, professor of comparative politics at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and research director at the Democratic Initiatives Foundation, explains how and why this is possible and what we should do about it.
For decades, Putin had support of the far right and the far left. It's not surprising that in Europe, it's not surprising that he had support of the far right in Europe because they are xenophobic, they are very nationalists, so it's not surprising they supported Putin. Regarding the far left, I think this is more complicated because not only the far left, but also social democrats were inclined to be Putin understanders, Putin verstehers. So I would like to elaborate on that. The basic argument here is that the left are fighting with nationalism. But it's surprising that they were supporting Putin, who is nationalist, who is chauvinistic, and who is also the product of oligarchs. And oligarchs enjoyed his rule very much, and Putin is aggressive. All of it goes contrary to what was traditional left slogans, that they were fighting with fascism, with imperialism, with aggression, and with dictators. So logically, the left should be against Putin, not in favor of him. Moreover, I would like to draw here one of the greatest examples in history of the left, which the left forget. This is about creation of the First International. And you know that in the creation of the First International, Marx and Engels, they were actively participating. So what was the initial impulse for creation of the First International? The aim was to support the Polish uprising of 1863, and this Polish uprising was against Russian Empire, because at that time Poland was occupied by the Russian Empire. So this was the aim of the First International, at least the initial aim, and it shows that there's no contradiction between the support of national independence and between left slogans of solidarity. So I think this should be taken into account for the far left, but also for center left, for social democrats, and we need to urge them. I think that now with the Russian war in Ukraine, the position of social democrats is changing, but still there are communists, there are other far left groups, and we should explain to them that support of the fight for national liberation war against aggressor is the right thing, and it's in full accordance with the solidarity proclaimed by the left.
Now that we are aware of the general and the most important trends driving international support for the Russian Federation, it is time to take a closer look at some of the specific countries and their stand on Russia, its war, and on support to Ukraine. Among them, Belarus is in a very peculiar situation. It is involved in the Russian aggression to the maximum, offering its infrastructure and strategic objects for the Russians to use against Ukraine. At the same time, the Belarusian leadership, much like the Kremlin, rules with terror. After the falsified elections in August 2020 and subsequent protests, it became clear that Belarusian government does not really represent Belarusian people, which is a situation quite different from Russia. We have Andriy Medvedev, a Belarusian journalist, who tells us about the situation in further detail.
Вітаю, шановне господарство. Мене звати Андрій Медведєв. Я журналіст з Білорусі, який минулим літом мусив утікати від репресій на родині в Україну. Ті ракети, які будили лютовським ранком українців, летіли з моєї родної Білорусі. А яшчэ праз нейкія гадзіны пад Кіїв падабраліся і расійская бронетэхніка, да іншыя вайсковыя машыны. І яны таксама прыехалі з Паднароўлі, Ельска, Мазыра на Гомельшчыне. А з Камарына і Гомеля ішлі калоны акупаваць Чарнігаў, Славуціч ды навакольныя мястэчкі і сёлы. Лукашенко, які незаконна насуперак волі большасці беларускага народа прысавечваў уладу ў Беларусі, ператварыў маю краіну не толькі ў палігон для выпрабавання таталітарных метадаў прыдушэння грамадства, але і зрабіў яе плацдармам для расійскай агрэсіі на суседні народ, з якім нас, беларусаў, павязвае шматстагоддзевая агульная гісторыя, вельмі блізкія мовы і падобныя менталітэты. Фактычна, у Беларусі, асабліва на маёй роднай Гомельшчыне, зараз гаспадараць расійскія вайскоўцы, і Беларусь гэтак жа захопленая, як і некаторыя часткі Украіны, толькі без адзінага стрэлу і са згоды узурпатара улады Лукашэнкі. Менавіта расійцы там адчуваюць сябе гаспадарамі. Мясцовыя ўлады не могуць і слова сказаць супраць іх, хаця яны псуюць землю, нявечаць экалогію, шкодзяць гусеніцамі танкаў дарогі. Мае землякі паведамлялі мне, што яшчэ падчас так званых вучэнняў, што расійскіх афіцэраў пазасялялі там у гатэлі, а жаўнераў у студэнцкія інтэрнаты. А ўжо пасля ўварвання расійскіх войскаў ва ўкраіну з памежных раёнаў Беларусі пачалі прыходзіць паведамленні, што абрубкамі расійскіх жаўнераў, якіх акупанты паспелі вывезці з Украіны, пазакладалі не толькі вайсковыя шпіталі, але і цывільныя лякарні, што расійцы бясплатна запраўляюцца палівам проста з урэзкі ў трубу ад мазырскага нафтаперапрацоўчага заводу, а чыгуначныя станцыі і каляіны пераведзеныя на абслугоўванне ваенных патрэбаў Расіі. Проста побач са многімі гарадамі стаяць пускавыя установкі ракет, якімі абстрэльваюць і Украіну. А на беларускіх ваенных і цывільных аэрадромах у Бокаве каля Мазыра, Зябраўцы каля Гомеля, Лунінцы ў Баранавічах і Берасейскай вобласці, у Лідзе на Гарадзеншчыне базуюцца расійскія знішчальнікі і бамбавікі з ракетамі тыпу «Кінжал», якімі таксама абстрэльваюцца ўкраінскія цывільныя аб'екты. Гэта для нас, беларусаў, не менш страшна, чым тыя жудасныя рэпрэсіі і катаванні, якія ўлада Лукашэнкі чыняць для нас саміх. І гэтыя рэпрэсіі не спыняюцца і цяпер. Толькі зараз лукашэнкаўская спецслужбы амаль цалкам пераведзеныя на абслугоўванне рускага ваеннага карабля. Унутраныя войскі і спецпадраздзяленні Міністэрства ўнутраных справаў патрулююць чыгуначныя каляіны, дзяжураць каля электронных прыладаў на чыгунцы. А лукашэнкаўскі аналаг гестапа, які завецца Губопік, праводзіць затрыманне соцень людзей, якія спрабуюць нешта рабіць супраць расійскай агрэсіі да Ўкраіны з боку тэрыторыі Беларусі. А такіх беларусаў немала. У нас зараз адбываецца сапраўдная рэйкавая вайна, калі людзі шкодзяць абсталяванне чыгункі, якое забяспечвае праходжанне расійскіх ваенных эшелонаў. Больш за 150 чыгуначнікаў затрыманыя з-за падазрэння ў спрыянні партызанам, якія шкодзяць чыгуначную інфраструктуру, каб не даць ездзіць па ёй расійскім войскам. А проста з-за выказвання меркавання супраць вайны ва Ўкраіне праз вязніцы 27 лютага, калі пачаліся антываенныя акцыі, прайшло сама мала 1500 беларусаў. Нягледзячы на рэпрэсіі, простыя беларусы працягваюць здымаць і апрылюдніваць звесткі аб тым, дзе, куды і якія калоны расійскіх войскаў перасоўваюцца, дзе грузяцца на чыгунку і разгружаюцца з яе, калі адбываюцца вылеты і пасадкі смертоносных летакоў і пускі ракетаў. Гэтая важная інфармацыя дазваляе абаронцам Украіны прымаць своечасовыя захады, каб знішчыць расійскія ракеты і самалёты, што ляцяць з тэрыторыі Беларусі. І ўсё гэта робяць не прадстаўнікі апазіцыі. Гэта робяць звычайныя беларусы, не чальцы нейкіх апазіцыйных арганізацыяў. Але і беларуская апазіцыя намагаецца, каб урад Лукашэнкі, які фактычна здаў нашу краіну расійскім агрэсарам, разам з расійцамі адчуў наступствы ад палітыкі садзейнічання агрэсіі. Дамагаюцца санкцыяў, спынення транзіту грузаў з Еўропы ў Расію праз Беларусь, фінансавых абмежаванняў, спынення сяброўства ў міжнародных арганізацыях і прыцягнення Лукашэнкі і ягоных памагатых да адказнасці і за катаванне свайго народу і за спрыяння ваенным злачынствам Расіі. Улады Беларусі ўжо даўно не з'яўляюцца прадстаўнікамі беларускага народа. Утрыманне ўлады Лукашэнкам з'яўляецца магчымым толькі з-за падтрымкі Пуціна. Таму зараз беларусы як могуць дапамагаюць набліжаць перамогу украінцаў над расійскімі захопнікамі. Бо менавіта з перамогай Украіны над Расіяй мы звязваем і свае шансы перамогі над дыктатарам Лукашэнкам.
Our friends from the Czech Republic now draw our attention to the two most crucial allies that Russia has left in Europe, Hungary and Germany. Albeit the situation is quite different in both countries, they are frequently singled out as the closest partners that the Kremlin has left. And let's find out more with Jakub Janda, and director of the European Values Center for Security Policy, about the general situation that drives both Hungary and Germany in their stand on Russia and on Ukraine.
At this moment, we could say that there are at least two European governments, two EU governments, which are the weakest points of the Western response to Russian war crimes in Ukraine. The first one is obviously Hungary, led by the Prime Minister Viktor Orban. And we all know that the Hungarian government has played a role of, I would call it the best ally of Russia in Europe, inside of EU and NATO for many years. But during the Russian war against Ukraine, the Hungarian government has actually stepped up their work or their support for Russian aggressive activities. And very practically, right now, the Hungarian government actually blocks any military assistance which could be sent through Hungary to Ukraine, which would logistically make big sense. But clearly, this is the way how the Hungarian government tries to sabotage Western, or you could say NATO countries responding with military assistance to Ukraine. We we have seen, for example, the Czech defense minister openly criticizing the Hungarian government for this, saying this is exactly how they help Putin, how they help the Russian war crimes in Ukraine, because there is no reason for it. There is no, it clearly makes sense if you get Russian money through oligarchs or energy deals between Russia and Hungary, then it makes sense as a Hungary to actually support Russia. But unfortunately, this is exactly what Russia wants, and this is exactly how Ukraine actually sabotages the defense of Ukraine and efforts of Western countries or NATO, other NATO countries to support Ukraine in a practical sense. The second government, which is unfortunately the enabler of more Russian war crimes in Ukraine, is Germany. And Germany does many positive things, so like financing many activities in Ukraine for a long time on the civilian side, and that's very positive. The problem is that actually the German government, led by the Chancellor, are actually the one who are usually blocking more hard sanctions, which would actually punish Russia for their war crimes in Ukraine. So some of the sanction packages are approved, and that's good news. But always if you ask European leaders which two governments are actually blocking new sanctions on Russia in most of the domains, usually they would tell you it's Hungary and it's Germany. There are different reasons for it, but I would say that the overall policy or mindset of majority of the German political establishment, including the previous government and the current government in Germany, is actually appeasement. And this is the long-term mindset of they are trying to appease Russia. And unfortunately, this has changed just a little. It has changed on the rhetorical level, but in practice, if you look over weapons deliveries or sanction packages, usually Germany is the one who is blocking or making it very slow. And that's the problem. So because if Germany would actually decide to use all of its political and economic power to punish Russia, it would make the Russian regime stop their atrocities in Ukraine much faster, because Germany is powerful in political and economic sense. But Germany has not yet decided to use its power to really stop, in political and economic terms, what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And I think it's a shame, and we basically last approximately 2 months actually are like a mirror. It actually shows what countries are. How do you respond during such a major war crime, war situation? And there you could see, unfortunately, Germany and Hungary, each for different reasons, but they are both enabling what Russia does in Ukraine. And I think they should be politically pressured by all of us, by allies of them in the EU and NATO.
After this message, it becomes clear that apparently it is time to take a closer look at what's going on in Hungary and see closer Viktor Orban's government that on one hand find itself under the pressure from the European Union and NATO, but on the other hand, it had been quite cozy with the Russian regime. This combination doesn't sit well, especially with Ukrainians. Mikhailo Drapak from Ukrainian Prism will tell us more about how things are in Hungary.
Among other European leaders, Prime Minister of Hungary Viktor Orban and other officials from the Hungarian government have a special position regarding the Russian aggression against Ukraine. On one hand, the Hungarian government condemned actions of Russia against Ukraine, condemned the attacks of the Russian Federation on February 24. Also, the official Budapest expressed its support for territorial integrity and for sovereignty of Ukraine. In addition, the Hungarian government expressed readiness to give any necessary humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Also, Hungary accepted hundreds of thousands of refugees from Ukraine since February 24. On the other hand, the Hungarian government denied any possibility to give weapons to Ukraine to protect against Russian attacks. And also the Hungarian government does not allow to use the Hungarian territory for transporting any weapons from the other countries to Ukraine. Viktor Orban and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Hungary, Péter Szijjártó, stated that their country will not support establishment of embargo on Russian oil and Russian natural gas. The reason for this is the fact that the Hungarian economy is highly dependent on Russian fuels. More than 90% of oil and natural gas of Hungary comes from Russia. So this step could stop the Hungarian economy, according to Viktor Orban. Also, previous week, Péter Szijjártó said that official Budapest currently is searching for a mechanism which will allow Budapest to pay for Russian natural gas in Russian rubles. So we do not see any possibility that in a short-term period Hungary and the Hungarian government will cut off its ties with Russia, or that it will make more tough steps towards Russia.
So apparently one of the states whose stand on Russian war and support for Ukraine has drawn a lot of criticism is Germany, as we've heard a couple of minutes ago. German reluctance to impose oil and gas embargo that would impede Russian capabilities substantially, and German delay in providing Ukraine with weapons that it needs can be explained by some of the complications in the German internal political context. Sergei Sumlenny, a former director of the Kiev office at the Heinrich Böll Foundation, is now based in Berlin. And from Berlin, he explained some of the internal political landscape and challenges driving German position.
When we talk about Germany's Russia-related politics and the role of Germany in Russian-Ukrainian war, we need to talk about two parts of the problem. First is a huge and terrible heritage by Angela Merkel, who tried for 16 years to appease Russia and to block Ukrainian membership in NATO and to press Ukraine into some sort of bad compromise with Russia in a Normandy format and in Minsk format. But also the current German government, which is dominated by the Social Democrat Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who was Angela Merkel's vice chancellor for the last legislative period. We know that Social Democrats are extremely pro-Russian party, not since like Gerhard Schröder, even earlier. If you look at Social Democrat chancellors, they always wanted to find some way to deal with Moscow on the costs of the countries between Germany and Soviet Union that time, or Germany and Russia now. We know that Olaf Scholz himself was a part of anti-NATO movement and visited several times GDR, where he was majestically received by the GDR authorities. And obviously these connections, they don't disappear. So now we see that the gap between the public opinion and the governmental action in Germany is huge. Maybe it is the worst gap since decades. We know that over 70% of the supporters of each and every of three ruling parties, the Liberals, Social Democrats and Greens, are in favor for delivering heavy weapons to Ukraine, while the government is hesitant to do it. Even the opposition, the Christian Democrats and Christian Social Union, they are in favor for delivery of the heavy weapons. So we have a broad consensus in Germany to deliver weapons to Ukraine, but the government is hesitant. Why? Because, as we know from the media reports and from the sources inside of the government, Chancellor Scholz obviously blocks it, and he's strictly against the delivery. Now we have actually a pretty legal problem in Germany, that despite the fact that foreign politics is a domain of the foreign ministry, which is ruled by the Green Minister Annalena Baerbock, legally the Chancellor may set the limits to these politics, which he gladly does. And obviously he does it also like in the gray zone, because as Social Democrat, he has a lot of influence in the ministry, in the foreign ministry, which was dominated by Social Democratic ministers since the last decades. Like all three predecessors of Annalena Baerbock were Social Democrats, Heiko Maas, Sigmar Gabriel, and Frank-Walter Steinmeier. So he has a lot of ways to influence what Annalena Baerbock does, even like without breaking the law or just like remaining in the gray zone, what he obviously does. So now we have the situation when the Greens and Liberals, who finally got into the government, and obviously for them, the so-called coalition peace is a very important asset, and they don't want to break up the government. They just follow in the way which Social Democrats sets for them, and Social Democrats don't want to fight Russia. They are afraid of Russian defeat, obviously. We know that not only the Chancellor Scholz, but also the representatives of Social Democrat Party in German region. So the regions, and especially the Social Democrat-dominated regions like Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, where the Social Democrat-run government installed legal vehicles to make Nord Stream 2 possible, they obviously have no interest in having fight with Russia. And they don't care about Ukraine, they care about their own interests, and that is a huge problem. Angela Merkel's heritage, Chancellor Scholz's influence in foreign politics, Social Democrats' interest in having good relations to Russia, and ignorance about what is happening in Ukraine, and which is worst, the fact that many politicians in Germany just don't want to know what is happening in Ukraine because they're focused only in Moscow.
Last but not least, we move on to France, whereas the situation is quite different from some of the states that we have already discussed, but it still remains rather complicated. For example, the recent claims made by the French President Emmanuel Macron about Ukraine and Russia being brotherly nations, and Macron's reluctance to recognize Russian actions in Ukraine as genocide show that in France there is still some lack of understanding of the situation on the ground. Not to mention, France finds itself in the midst of a very strong and very competitive, as well as very challenging electoral campaign. And Tatiana Agarkova, the head of international outreach at Ukraine Crisis Media Center, walks us through the challenges behind this electoral campaign.
Let's talk about who is behind the international support for Putin's regime now, and let's have a closer look at what France is today. France is known for its diplomatic effort to help Ukraine starting from 2014, for the moment where Crimea Peninsula was annexed by Russian Federation illegally, and when the local war in Donbass started, and the result, some territories were occupied by Russia. France, together with Germany, was in this so-called Normandy format for many years and in Minsk agreements. But now the situation changed dramatically, because after the full-scale war of Russia against Ukraine, we've seen many diplomatic efforts of French President Emmanuel Macron, who was visiting Russia many times before the war, trying to convince Vladimir Putin not to start this war, but as we now know that it was without any significant result. And now what is important to understand that France is entering a very complicated electoral campaign. So after this first tour, we see two candidates. On the top, we see Emmanuel Macron and his opponent Marine Le Pen, who's a leader of a far-right party for many years already. And this candidate, Marine Le Pen, she has a very close ties to Russia. Namely, her electoral campaign back in 2017 was partially financed by Russia, and they are still paying back this money. So this relationship is not neutral, it is a real close link. Starting from the very beginning of this war of Russia against Ukraine, Marine Le Pen was very cautious not to mention Russia, not to condemn Russia. So we've heard that she was condemning this Russian aggression, but her rhetoric is kind of mild rhetoric about what was going on. Explicitly, for example, after Bucha massacre, as we call it, she was not ready to talk about war crimes, for example. And And the most important issue is about sanctions. So Marine Le Pen, when Emmanuel Macron was busy with international agenda, with the war and all these issues, she didn't lose her time. She was visiting many French regions. She was talking to people. She was talking to people on domestic issues, namely on prices and on energy as well. It is an important issue in France. And she was playing that in order to improve her position in political situation, and she succeeded. So that's why we can by that we can explain this little difference in the first tour, because they have only about 5% of difference. But now, in 2 weeks, France will be voting for the second time, and we will know the name of the French president. And we are to do everything possible for Marine Le Pen not to win these presidential elections, because we do know that she's already talking about Russia and about the relationship with Russia after the war. So she's saying that Russia will not move anywhere; it will be still there, and we are to find a kind of dialogue. So her rhetoric and her approach to Russia is much more open, I would say, to compromise, to find a common language. And this is dangerous for Ukraine, because this will mean less sanctions, less effective sanctions, and less military support for Ukraine, because and this is important, because the only way for Ukraine to win this war is to have extremely strong sanctions, and to have international support, and to have military supplies. I mean all kind of weapons Ukraine needs now. So now this election is decisive not only for France, but it's also decisive for Ukraine, a big European country. We need France support, and we have all chances to have more support if Emmanuel Macron is elected president.
Thank you for staying with us at Ukraine in Flames and finding out what drives the international support of the Putin's regime and the Russian Federation in their war against Ukraine. Of course, there are still many countries, many actors and factors that we didn't have an opportunity to tackle so far. For example, the role of the People's Republic of China, or how Russian disinformation facilitates support for its actions in the Middle East. But these are the issues for a further discussion that we will hold some other time. And if you want to listen to it, then please subscribe to our channel. Also, don't forget to like and share this video if you find our job useful. And in the description to this particular episode, you can find information on how you personally can help Ukraine in the face of the Russian aggression. Remember that everything is going to be Ukraine.